During the CB boom of the 1980s, there were many people on the air 24/7 on 27 MHz, but there was another variation of CB which many may have never even heard of, and that is 934 MHz. The use of 934 MHz for CB goes back to the beginnings of the legal CB days in the United Kingdom. The original proposals were modified in terms of both frequency and antenna specification during its lifetime, but despite these changes and an embargo on the import and manufacture of new equipment, the band remained popular with enthusiasts and experimenters for many years. Dismissed as a gimmick when it first appeared, the so-called experts of the time said that the stations would be lucky to operate across the road with the specification allowed. It didn't look promising with low power and low gain antennas and high feeder losses. The specifications were coupled with the view that operators were seen as lacking the technical background to work with these frequencies. But the experiences and results from the early pioneers of 934 MHz showed that the facts didn't match these so-called expert predictions. A British company called Revtech soon produced the first practical 934 MHz transceiver and matching antennas for the market. There were originally 3 models in total, starting with the Mark I. Soon after, the Mark II was released, which was a really nice radio and was quite popular, and the Revtech base station, which is now extremely rare. Other early rigs were the Grandstand Transverter for 27 into 934 MHz and the ultra-rare Westminster dual-band base station. The last somewhat successful British set produced was the UniAce 400, but by this time imports were emerging from Japan. It didn't take long for the Japanese to identify the UK as a potential market for 934 MHz CB radio. In fact, they were already exporting a similar system to Switzerland. The Comtel Personal MPR 934 was the first of the Japanese imports, followed by 2 similar handheld models and the Cybernet Delta 1 rig. Now, Revtech are mostly responsible for getting 934 MHz started in the UK, and a company called Celltronics of Canvey Island set up the first specialist dealership. However, it was Nevada Communications in Portsmouth who helped to accelerate the band's growth with the Delta 1 rig. The Cybernet Delta 1 was described as the Mini Cooper of 934 MHz. It was small, neat, full of features, had good ergonomics and was reliable, and it took the band by storm. There were also 2 Clarion transceivers on the market around this time as well. These were state-of-the-art personal radio system transceivers for Switzerland with all kinds of selective calling and control features. The Clarion showed what may have been at the time, but that is another story. Due to the cost of radios and the popularity of 27 MHz, the use of 934 MHz was patchy throughout the UK during the mid-1980s, with activity being confined to small geographical pockets. The intensity of operation increased southwards from Scotland through the north of England and into eastern and southern England. In Wales, activity was mainly restricted to the north and south coasts, and in Northern Ireland and the Channel Islands, activity was limited to a few dedicated operators. The years 1986 to 1988 were probably the golden years of 934 MHz, with superb lift conditions reported as well. Like any UHF frequency, day-to-day propagation on 934 MHz is more or less line of sight, even more so than bands such as 70 cm. However, as the frequency is suitable for radar applications, it's subject to reflected and scattered signals. This scattering effect can lead to some irregular signal enhancements and can also send signals around corners, producing unexpected signal paths between stations. This is similar to auroral propagation but extremely localised. Propagation both by ducting and refraction was also quite common on 934 MHz. Local morning or evening temperature inversions would often enhance conditions. Also, propagation over low-lying land or sea paths could enable ranges well in excess of 150 km. Stations in low-lying locations but with good takeoff for their signals would often experience knife-edge bending of their signals. Atmospheric conditions over faraway ridges could also bend the signals over the ridge and down the other side. Full-blown tropospheric refraction propagation enabled sustained directional propagation over hundreds of kilometres on low power and with simple antennas. One confirmed contact noted around 1988 was from Jersey, an island in the English Channel, to County Antrim in Ireland, over 700 kilometres away. Successful operation on 934 MHz depended mainly on antenna location. As with most of the VHF and UHF bands, the higher the antenna and the least amount of obstructions in the way, the better. At higher frequencies, obstacles cause more of a problem. Even mature trees in full leaf could attenuate signals at 934 MHz, so many users went mobile due to their home location not being suitable. This caused another issue because 934 MHz was mostly unsuitable for car-to-car contacts, even over short distances. It was also limited for car-to-home base operations over distances more than 7 to 10 kilometres. The best results came from marine mobile operations or from hilltops, especially during lift conditions. Like 27 MHz, the band was informal, but was better known for the high standard of operating between users. Operators stuck to a code of practice that was polite, friendly and sensible. Users at the time said they hadn't experienced some of the worst cases of abuse like those seen on 27 MHz and even some of the amateur bands around that time. The illegal use of linear amplifiers was generally frowned upon, although the limited availability of them prevented any serious abuse. Power microphones were acceptable and some individual operators even tried out repeaters, phone patches and various data communication modes, all of which were actually prohibited. There was interest among some 934 MHz operators in designating one channel nationally for use with packet radio for one-to-one communication, digipeating and the use of personal mailboxes, but this never happened. The band was essentially populated with clusters of stations, separated by what were known as no-go areas, usually high ground or other barrier features. There may have been as many as 1,000 estimated stations still active on the air by the early 1990s, with half as many, again, temporarily silent. Many 934 MHz users held amateur radio licenses, and there were also a few junior operators and quite a high proportion of women on the band. The call-in channel was usually channel 10 or 20. Disappointingly, except under lift conditions, it was usually common to hear only one or two channels in use compared to the high level of use on 27 MHz. A popular aspect of band usage was mobile operation from high ground, which had a large following in some areas. Mobile antennas for 934 MHz were mainly vertically polarised collinears in various designs, including the original RefTech models that looked similar to the cell phone antennas of the time. Other antennas were over a metre long, and the most easily identified were the Nevada mobile collinears with their distinctive orange base and airspace phasing coils. Collinears made good base station antennas as well as mobile antennas, and many were shrouded for weather protection and used at home. Directional antennas mimicked amateur radio designs, with some commercial models made as derivatives of either loops or Yagis, quads, helical beams, skeleton slots and even dishes. And many operators used a pre-receive amplifier capable of boosting incoming signals by as much as 20 dB. The 934 MHz Club UK was the only specialist organisation representing 934 MHz users. The Personal Radio Club of Great Britain existed for a time but wasn't active by the early 1990s. The 934 MHz Club UK used to run contests on the band, but in the late 1980s the contests were discontinued by the club committee due to lack of support. They did run some award schemes and also activity days, and members congregated at some of the regional radio rallies. Like 27 MHz, call signs weren't used on 934 MHz CB, however there were G9 test and development call signs allocated to some of the experimenters. Test and development licenses were a useful concept which allowed people to carry out all kinds of research which may not be allowed on normal CB bands or licensed amateur bands. By the late 1980s, the cost of a test and development licence was around £50. A number of 934 MHz experimenters held test and development call signs, and they could often be heard on the air. The call sign was not used for normal communications, so it wasn't protocol to interrupt them, as they were more than likely engaged in some sort of commercial work. There were numerous test and development call signs associated with 934 MHz users, such as Clive G9BWZ in Gloucestershire, Fred G9BTN in Norfolk, Jim G9BSP in Southampton, the Citizens Band Association G9BRY, and Andy G9BUP. There was also G9CBE and G9BWB, both assigned to unknown operators. By the late 1980s, there was a peak in operator numbers and a steady supply of good quality equipment, but there was a serious blow to the whole thing. The government proposed reallocating the 934 MHz frequency to a commercial digital voice service, a proposed PMR-like service for small firms and large commercial sites. By the early 1990s, this service had still not materialised, but the authorisation to manufacture or import 934 MHz transceivers was withdrawn. The existing 934 MHz users could continue to operate as long as their stations were capable, although new equipment became very scarce and second-hand items were in short supply. Despite continuing assurances that the band would continue to decline gracefully by natural attrition over many years, a significant number of operators opted to leave the band altogether. During the late 1990s, the Radio Communications Agency announced that the 934 MHz Citizens Band radio service would be withdrawn on the 31st of December 1998. The performance specification to which all 934 MHz CB transceivers were manufacturer certified was withdrawn in 1988, and since that date no new sets were manufactured or imported. The agency allowed users of 934 MHz to continue the use of their existing equipment, but always made it clear that this was for a limited period. In the end, the RA gave permission to Cellnet and Vodafone to operate analogue mobile phones on a temporary basis on the 934 to 935 MHz band as part of a plan to reorganise this part of the spectrum and with the intention of increasing capacity for both digital GSM telephones and analogue in the upper part of the 900 MHz band. This was deemed necessary to accommodate the continuing enormous growth in the demand for mobile phones, in particular the new digital services, without adversely affecting analogue users. Naturally, 934 MHz CB equipment would clash with this new usage, and therefore they took the decision to withdraw the band altogether. There is still some enthusiasm for 934 MHz today, both on the air and within online groups, and equipment does come up on online auction sites regularly, but this is still not legal to use.